Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. Today is a special episode because the audience kind of chose it. I've had over 16 people on this calendar year of 2025 send a request that I cover the Book of Enoch, First Enoch specifically. And a good friend of mine that I graduated high school with sent me a message on the side and said, "Hey, you should cover this." I was like, "Well, I did a few years ago. Here's the old podcast." But then I realized I actually didn't do it in a video form. So I figured I need to go back and cover it a little bit more in depth, and then also cover the elements of it in a video. So that way it is both on the podcast and also YouTube, because at the time that I did it, we weren't on YouTube as Facts. So I figured today we'd cover these very specific things about the Book of Enoch. It's an important discussion on the fact that there are churches that accept it as canonical, and we see it represented in New Testament writings, which we're going to show today. And then there's elements of it where it seems to be accurate. And so there's places where people have a lot of questions, like, how literal should I take this? How accurate should I take this? Should I ignore everything except for where it is represented in the New Testament? Should I accept the whole thing? So I'm asking the question today and then answering that question. Why is in the Book of Enoch in the Bible? So let's kind of dive into this. I'm going to bring up some slides in just a second, and we're going to examine the fullness of this question, because at the end of the day, we all have the question. We all are dealing with this question in relation to the Book of Enoch. How many books are there to begin with? That's the start of the whole question. How many books of Enoch are there? Because most people think there's only one. Well, that's actually not true. There's more than one. There's 3 books of Enoch. First Enoch is the most prominent, the one that everyone seems to be referring to when they talk about the Book of Enoch. And then we're going to see in a minute that it is split into 5 different sections. So you have First Enoch, Second Enoch, Third Enoch. Most people are focusing on First Enoch, which is broken into 5 separate sections. Now, this one is also known as the Ethiopic Enoch, or the first Book of Enoch. And it is the one that is most widely containing the books that people are familiar with. The Book of the Watchers is probably the most prolific and most cited, and is certainly the one that is represented in the New Testament. We also see it well represented in the writings of Qumran when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to break all these down. You have the Book of Parables. You also have these different books of the outer space, the luminaries. You see the visions and dreams, and then you see the epistle. But this one is the one that is considered canonical by the Ethiopian churches, as well as a few of the Orthodox sects. We're going to look at that a little bit more in depth shortly. But this is the book that everybody is typically referring to, First Enoch, which is broken down into 5 sections. Most people don't know there's actually a Second Enoch as well. It's known as the Slavonic Enoch, or the Book of the Secrets of Enoch. Now, the reason it's called the Slavonic Enoch is because it is only represented in the Old Church Slavonic manuscripts. Now, it expands on to First Enoch, and it also not only expands, it actually adds to it. It creates nuances from certain sayings or statements or epistles. And so you can tell it is very familiar with the first writing that we're going to be covering mostly today, but it gives almost a further meaning and a further exposition to what we find in First Enoch. There's also a Third Enoch, probably the least known to anyone. It is called the Hebrew Enoch, or the Book of Palaces. Now, this book is typically identified with rabbinical teaching known as a Rabbi Ishmael. Now, in the 5th century, the Hebrew rabbinic texts are linked to different mysticisms, and really looking back at Enoch's transformation as he becomes an angel named Metatron. Now, I find this one absolutely bizarre, because it looks at his ascension, that he is transformed, he's taken into the ascension, but they believe in this Ishmael rabbi teaching that he becomes an angel. That one's out in left field to me, and I think it is the least understood and relied upon writing of Enoch. But there are 3 books of Enoch, and so we need to be more specific when we're talking about the writings, whether we're referring to book 1, book 2, or book 3. And then when we get into our main one, book 1, it becomes a little bit difficult because I want to actually take down the date here. So what about the date of First Enoch? What should we conclude about its writing? Well, it's written in sections, and I don't think we can just put them all in the same era. I don't think they are in the same era. There are a total of 5 sections, as we discussed, and it possibly began around the year 300 to 250 BC, and it continues really into the end of the 1st century BC. And I'm going to argue in this video that it continues even into the 1st century AD or CE. So let's talk about its manuscripts, because this is really where the rubber meets the road. There are various manuscripts that actually help us date this. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most prominent are Aramaic. These were found mostly in Cave 4. There are also Greek and very few Latin fragments of this. And there's even small fragments in Hebrew found in Cave 1. The most complete copies we have of the entire First Enoch comes not from Greek, not from Hebrew, Aramaic, or Latin, but writings from the Ethiopic language known as Ge'ez. Now, what's interesting is those Ge'ez manuscripts are split into 2 separate families. Why do I think this is important to clarify? Because those that are arguing for it belonging in the canon, there are those, in fact, there's evangelicals that have revisited the subject saying, well, maybe we should consider these as canonical. I think that we need to have a deeper discussion about why that shouldn't happen, represented in the Ethiopic Church. Now, I don't want to overstate this, but when you look at the different variants or you look at the different families, they're not all identified as the same. They don't all read the same. So that means you have to do textual analysis. That means you have to do critical text work. Now, I'm not saying that eliminates it, because we obviously have critical text even in our New Testament and our Old Testament as it continues to develop in textual criticism. But we're not looking at primary languages. The Book of Enoch would have been written most likely in Hebrew or a combination of Hebrew and Aramaic. So these are going to be very relatable terms and relatable languages as we talk about the subject. But the next primary source is Greek, or even Latin for that matter, maybe even in that order. But what we know of the Ethiopic text is that it doesn't seem to derive from the Hebrew fragments we have, or even the Aramaic for that matter. They're closely related to the Greek, which means it is a translation of a translation. And again, that doesn't mean that we just throw it out and say, well, it's just unreliable in every way, shape, or form. That's not what I'm saying. But the textual critical editions of the New Testament that we have are typically based on primary language of Koine Greek and broken down into helps through Latin or Old Church Slavonic, oddly enough, or when you look at it from the perspective of even the Ge'ez language, although those are much, much later. We also have different languages representing closer proximity of time and date, and even language styles, like, for example, the Coptic language, which is also broken into 2 families. So the New Testament manuscripts are very much based on primary sources. The Ethiopic isn't even based on a translation of the primary language in which this document was likely written, but second hand, a translation of a translation. And to me, that becomes problematic as we break this down. So let's talk about the content. Book 1 falls into the category of 5 sections, as I stated. Book 1 and section 1 is the Book of the Watchers. This covers chapters 1 through 36. Again, most prolific section of all. Book 2 is the Book of the Parables. That's from chapter 37 to chapter 71. Book 3 specifically is the Heavenly Luminaries. That's 72 to 82. And then book 4 is the Book of Dreams. That's 83 through 90. Not a very long section. And it's you're going to see quite interesting in its content, but it is important to understanding the dating of this and how it develops. Book 5 is the epistle, or really the teaching of Enoch himself, specifically to his children. We'll break that down. That's from 91 to 108. Now, these were likely 5 separate works gathered and compiled, given through redaction and everything, into one giant book or one giant document. So to say, oh, we got to look at this canonically, we really need to break this down into sections and say, well, which part would be canonical? Are we going to assume that a progressive work over a long period of time would be brought into one book? Now, I'm not saying that's impossible. The reason I say that is because the book of Psalms is broken down into books, and it was a combination of a lot of writings over a period of time, from the writings of Moses himself, developed even into the children of the priest of that time, all the way to Second Temple Judaism. So I'd have no problem saying that, yeah, a developmental timeline can be canonical, and it can be broken into different sections and different styles. We see this even in the writing of the Psalms. So I wouldn't deny that just on that premise. So let's look at all 5 of these in a brief summary. Let's talk about the Book of the Watchers. The Book of Watchers, as I stated, is probably the oldest section. We have fragments of this section in Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they date between the 1st and 2nd century BC. So we can easily say that Christians didn't have influence on this. They have no reason to manipulate sections. There are some that advocate for King James onlyism that I found intriguing as I've had this discussion with them in the past. They're like, well, what they're quoting in Jude and what they're quoting in 2 Peter, or at least alluding to, must come from the other way around, meaning Jude was first, 2 Peter was first, this book came later. These are corruptions, insertions, and textual variations that have been brought onto the table because of the New Testament, not the other way around, because they can't cope with the fact that Jude quoted from the Book of the Watchers and that 2 Peter alludes to the Book of the Watchers. So therefore, no way. These are redactions. These are later insertions. These are later corruptions. These are later abbreviations that have been brought in by other scribes that have been made into what we have represented today. The problem with that is we have representation of these in Aramaic in the 1st and 2nd century BC that precede Jude and 2 Peter that are represented in Qumran communities. That's not possible. So we see it's probably one of the more older, and it is obviously the most well-known. What about in its discussion of the idea of the Watchers to begin with? Where are they getting this language? Well, it seems like they're borrowing from Daniel chapter number 4, verse 13, verse 17, and verse 23. Now, I want to give you the breakdown of what these Watchers are, because this is part of the discussion that everybody has. Now, I'm going to read Daniel 4 for us in just a second, and then I'm going to break this all down. Here's another important thing to understand about the Watchers, because it helps us date Daniel. Now, some have alleged that Daniel was created at the same timeline that these documents would have been created. I find that hard to believe, and I did an entire episode. I've actually debated with Jonathan Sheffield, 2 people, on the subject of Daniel and its dating. And then in a follow-up, Jonathan and I had a discussion, a friendly conversation with Dr. Richard Carrier. Now, we did a discussion in relation to the date, and this was one of the main primary sources I used against Dr. Carrier in the discussion, where I stated, we have Qumran representation at the same time. What's the likelihood that these representatives are writing documents and commentaries while the book was also being written? Not likely. They're obviously copying something. They're obviously referring back to something that they call as the prophet of Daniel. We see this in the writings of Qumran, referring to Daniel as a prophet, looking backward, looking at a time and an age with him represented in a group of other prophets. So to say that Daniel was written at the same time gets debunked pretty easily, in my opinion, by Qumran. Now, I have good friends who highly disagree with me, like Dr. Kip Davis and other Dead Sea Scroll scholars, who just say, no, it's possible there's early representations of Daniel, but the whole book cannot be collectively earlier than this exact same time period. It could be that they're borrowing from earlier, but they themselves were written around the same time. I think this actually fights back against that premise. I don't think it works. I'll also be having a discussion very soon, again, with Orthodox Jews. I'll be on their channel shortly, having the very discussion about the Son of Man and Daniel, and we'll be having a good discussion about that, as well as the manuscripts and the dating of them. But I do want to read for us from Daniel chapter 4, verse 13, some of these passages. He says, I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay in my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher. Now notice how it translates here in English. Angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. Later in verse 17. This sentence is by decree of the angelic watchers, and a decision is a command of the holy ones, in order the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind. Also verse 23 in the same section. He says, and the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one. Notice how that holy one continually gets attached to this. And then on some English translations, the word angelic watcher, descending from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it. So in the Enoch literature, the watchers, as we see in Daniel, seem to be some sort of angelic beings. Some are righteous, others are evil and fallen. The book of First Enoch primarily focuses on 200 fallen watchers who descended down from heaven. Second Enoch, the Slavonic Enoch, gives additional details and commentary to this on how and why the rebellion actually took place. Now, third Enoch also goes back and alludes to this, and it shifts all of its attention to the righteous as opposed to the fallen. So first Enoch introduces 200 fallen angels, if you would, these watchers. Now, second Enoch gives details about them and why the rebellion occurred. Third Enoch doesn't even want to focus on the fallen, and it shifts all of its attention to the righteous ones, which seems to be implied even in the book of Daniel itself. So it could be borrowing from Daniel and much of its language. Now, in this, those who sought to corrupt humanity in the writing of First Enoch were led by 10 chief rulers, 10 chief watchers. Now, you'll find this in First Enoch chapter 6, verse 6 through 8, which is very compatible with Genesis 6, may I add. So this idea, and I reject this idea, that the writing of Genesis refers to the descendants of Cain and Seth intermingling, I reject that. It comes much, much later. There is no interpretations during this time period and even during the time of Jesus. And I would argue even the New Testament writers would accept any kind of interpretation of the writings being that of, in Genesis 6, the descendants of Seth and the descendants of Cain intermingling on the earth. I reject that. I don't see that. I would love for that to be true. I'd actually, as much as I consider myself an Augustinian, I would love for Augustine's allusion to this to be true. And obviously the reformers popularized it. I would sleep better at night if it wasn't. I would find it more comfortable to have a position if it wasn't the case. But we cannot get away from the fact that what we find in harmony with Genesis 6 and the writings, that the sons of God, the Bain Elohim, that took on some sort of form that intermingled sexually with women on earth, had children, unnatural births, men of renown, these giants, as the King James translation and many older translations put into English. These later as represented by the Rephaim in Deuteronomy, which also seem to be the problem that fight against the children of Israel entering into the land. So you have these Rephaim later developing from these groups of giants, these watchers that were on the earth. There seems to be a lot of Nephilim, Rephaim debates today. The Nephilim in Genesis 6, the Rephaim in Deuteronomy. Where do they come from? What is their origin? What is their conception? Did they come from just being really strong men who had really good reputations of their size, their demeanor, their warfare? Or are they actually hybrids? Are they some sort of corruption of humanity? And what brought the flood? Just simply evil in the world? Or did it become the genes of humanity? The genetics were broken down. All of these things become major discussions, and they're uncomfortable to have, really, especially if we're talking about mythology and how Christianity is not based on myth and that Old Testament teachings are not based on myth. It makes you look funny and feel funny if you side with the fact that these are angelic beings that came down and did something. But there is no denial that at this time period of Second Temple Judaism and interpretations, as well as New Testament writers, that this is the way they perceive Genesis 6. And the evidence of things like that is in the Book of the Watchers. We find compatible language with that of First Enoch 6. Now note this, and when they were of 200 who descended in the days of Jared, now remember, he's mentioned in Genesis as well, upon the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves there by the mutual imprecations. These are the names of their leaders, and it lists them, Samalza being the chief of them, all the way down, and then it gives you the total of 10, the chief of tens, broken down into each group of 200. So it's interesting that we find this comparison to what we have in Genesis chapter 6. Now, among them, you have a name. Azazel stands out as having taught humanity to craft weapons of war and introducing violence and bloodshed into the world. There's also teachings where women are taught how to paint their faces and make themselves more beautiful. There's all this discovery and invention that comes to make them better and more advanced in civilization. You find all of that in the Book of the Watchers. You can also see the term applied to Raphael, who's one of the angels listed in the Deuterocanonical books later, who helps chain these fallen ones in chapter 22, verse 6. Now, he also is mentioned earlier with Michael, Gabriel, and Uriel in the chapter 9 of 1 Enoch as a messenger who is informing God of what was going on in the earth. So you find this notorious angel Raphael. The first chapter of Enoch is the one that is quoted by Jude 1:14. And the description of Enoch in Jude is from chapter 60, verse 8, where it reads, the seventh from Adam. So again, where Jude comes into play, Jude is quoting from the Book of the Watchers. Now, second Enoch is not mentioned at all by the New Testament, nor is third. But Second Peter does allude to 1 Enoch 20, verse 2, when teaching on this place where angels were sent to be tortured named Tartarus. Now, Tartarus is a place where gods were being punished. And in Enoch, it's these watchers who corrupted humanity during the days of Noah. So Enoch is referenced in the New Testament. Yes, it is. Second Peter and also Jude referred to it on a couple of occasions in reference to the Book of the Watchers. The New Testament doesn't seem to quote outside of Book 1, nor does it seem to cite Second Enoch or Third Enoch, no doubt, because they're later. Now, in the Book of Parables, we find ourselves in chapters 37 through 71 of Book 1, and there are three main parables that are consistent mostly with judgment and the end time events. It also deals with the ascension of Enoch, which we see described in the book of Genesis. Now, there is a use of the phrase Son of Man. He is described as sitting on the throne of glory for final judgment. Now, that's interesting because the Son of Man is seemed to be interpreting Daniel 7. The question is the book of Enoch influenced by Daniel or the New Testament writers like the Gospel of Mark, or is it both? Or did it come after all that? Well, many scholars deny an early date of this section due to its overly Christian influence within its narrative. They mainly argue the premise from the fact that this section was not found in Qumran and is missing from Greek translation. By the way, I want to echo that I agree with that. I do think that it is very possible that this section is influenced by Christian literature later. And it wouldn't surprise me by the least bit if this is the most unreliable section in all. This is why I say, when we talk about it being canonical, we got to scratch our heads and say, is it possible, especially if the Book of Parables is influenced later by Christian documents? I think it becomes very problematic. There are major issues with this section, including contradictions about the Son of Man. Enoch is dying and then ascending to heaven. Well, did he die? Is he ascended? Is he assumed before death, after death? This becomes part of the debate. There's also major inconsistencies in this section. It's probably one of the most inconsistent sections of the entire book. Let's talk about now the heavenly luminaries from 72 to 82. This section can be traced at least to the 2nd century BC because we have fragments of it found in Qumran. Uriel, the angel, gives Enoch a tour into the heavens, showing him the movement of the heavenly bodies. So this is a visionary form. Now, in this, a calendar was formed from these heavenly bodies, which created a number of 364 days, giving it a calendar very similar to what we have in the Gregorian calendar. Now, the next book is called the Book of Dreams from 83 to 90. It is absolutely allegorical in every way of the history of Israel. Its allegory depicts the main figure of Noah and all of his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, getting off the ark. It uses different color bulls to represent each of them. Remember, it's an allegory. It also covers the death of Noah, which we don't see a lot of in the book of Genesis. Then it goes after that. It covers Moses to Solomon's temple, to the second temple being built after the destruction of the Babylonians. So this becomes instrumental at timeline when we're trying to give a timeline to this, that this was definitely written after the destruction of the temple in Babylon. It's not early. It can't be any earlier than Second Temple Judaism. Then it goes into the section of the epistles, the letter of Enoch in 91 to 108. Now, Enoch admonishes his children in this, and he gives them admonishments in righteousness and deals with it as not only the righteous, but sinners. It speaks of all the sin that is done on earth being recorded in heaven, and God and the Messiah dwelling with man, which is very interesting on, once again, how do we date this? It also goes not with Noah's death, but rather his birth. So let's kind of tear this in. Let's tear into this a little bit. Why can't it be canonical? We see these sections of First Enoch. We see what they represent. We see what they teach. And I just gave you short, really small levels of it. And I want you to read it if you have time. Please read the book of First Enoch. Read the book of the Watchers. Read the parables. Read the luminaries. These are really important things for you to understand what the Jews thought about certain times of history and period and restoration. It also will help you understand why the New Testament writers had no problem alluding to it. But why can it not be in the Bible? Why can't it just be in the canon? Let's talk about 6 reasons. 1, it lacks canonical reception. Outside of the Ethiopian and the Ethiopian Orthodox churches, First Enoch was never received in the Old Testament canon and any of its wider jurisdictions. So the Eastern Orthodox, North African, Coptics, Roman Catholics, none of their councils, none of their synods recognize this in the wider Catholic sense. Yes, the Ethiopian Church does, and former sections of the Orthodox do as well, but it is not in the canonical side of things universally. 2, it is absent in the Hebrew Bible amongst anything else. First Enoch was not a part of the Tanakh, which served really as a foundation of the Old Testament canon used by Christ, his apostles, and Judaism of that day. So it's not received historically in the Hebrew sense. It's not received historically in the church sense, whether you're talking about the Eastern Orthodox, North African, Roman Catholic, or any of the Assyrian or Coptic churches. They did not accept this text as canonical, nor did the Jews on any side of the debate, even in Judaism. Here's a 3rd reason. We're uncertain of its provenance and its tradition, and we're also uncertain of its fragmentary manuscript tradition, because those 2 things I think should be held collectively. So while we have fragments of First Enoch that have been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, mostly in Aramaic, no complete Hebrew or Aramaic copy exists today. The full text that we have, as I stated earlier, survives in the Ge'ez language, which is broke down into 2 families of Ethiopic transmission. No historic completion of Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin exists, only in Ge'ez, which, again, is translated from the Greek texts. Now, the Greek texts are more full. You'll find more of it in Greek than you will in the fullness of Aramaic or Hebrew. But in its composition collectively, it is in Ge'ez. It is in the Ethiopic language. Now, as I stated, we have a problem. So you have Aramaic, you have Greek, you have Ethiopic. That's how we have it. What if it was really written in Hebrew first and then Aramaic? Now you have Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, then Ethiopic. So that would be a translation of a translation of a translation. That's not very reliable. I don't think that's something we can bank on and feel good about. I think it actually becomes far more problematic in the discussion of textual analysis and textual critical work. We don't have that problem in the New Testament, and we don't even have that problem in the Old Testament. So if this is the true canonical form, it has to be in English. For us, a translation from Ethiopic, which is a translation from Greek, which is a translation from Aramaic, and maybe a translation from Hebrew. A lot is lost in the transmission of that. But we really don't have a full composition outside of Ethiopic for true canonical status. And in that case, it almost feels and looks like God didn't preserve his word. Now, can he do it that way? Sure. I'm not saying God's limited, but is that the process we see in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament through that kind of means? No, not really. I don't necessarily accept that. Here's a fourth reason. It can be traced, or it traces to Enoch. It cannot be traced to Enoch himself. All three books of Enoch are him claiming to be Enoch, but clearly we showed that they're not. How do you get the Babylonian destruction of Israel through the temple and all that happened in Jerusalem during the life of Enoch, who's around before Noah, the seventh from Adam? Can't be. A literary device in this is common in apocryphal works. It is in literature that we see time and time again. It's incompatible with the canonical requirements to give us a genuine prophetic and apostolic authorship, for that matter. In this case, it would be prophetic more than apostolic. But we see no quality that we find in these other books that lead to the composition of this collective work to be called canonical. Fifth, its use of the New Testament does not imply canonical status either. This is the big one for a lot of people. Well, the New Testament quotes from it, so therefore it must be canonical. Now, Jude 14 through 15 quotes First Enoch as we discussed. So does 2 Peter. It alludes to Tartarus in the writings of chapter 20. But the quotation or allusion that these New Testament writers give do not give us canonical status automatically. I mean, my goodness, we've talked about this before. Paul quotes pagan poets in Acts 17 and Titus 1. Does that mean those pagan poets are canonical? The New Testament writers use it as a familiar literary source, yes, not as divinely inspired scripture. Folks, hear me out. When we're looking at this with an open mind and a fair thought, what we conclude in these things is that there is reliable truth in documents outside of canonical. This is the problem with sola scriptura. This is the problem with solo scriptura, looking at things like, oh, well, that's not Bible. It's not trustworthy. No one else treated things that way, not even the New Testament writers. It's not how we do history either. There are things in the book of First Enoch, or in these books broken into 5 sections, that are true historically, prophetically, that can be traced to truth, because all truth belongs to God, and God is not limited to giving truth only through canonical means. You can have true things happening outside of the canon, and the canonical writers under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit can see the clarity and cleanness of that and give an insight by God himself to say, indeed, this is true. Indeed, Enoch did say, indeed, this event, this story is true. The final reason, canonical finality before the Christian era. By the time of Jesus and the apostles, the Hebrew scriptures were already considered closed in terms of prophetic writings. First Enoch is absent from the corpus that is found in all of these other things that we have compiled, and was never viewed as scripture by the covenant community of God from the Jews or from the church. And by that very means, it should be eliminated as a viable source for the writings of the church. So I reject it on that basis. I reject it on that premise. I do not see it as canonical. I do see it as helpful. I do see it as something that you should read. I think not only should you read book 1 in First Enoch and all of its 5 breakdowns and sections, I think you should also read Second Enoch, the Slavonic edition, and then you should also read Third Enoch. Now, they're a little bit harder to find, but there are English translations that are available for you to read. Now, read them with all of the nuances and context that we have just discussed and put around them, put a giant parenthesis there, but also see the formation and see the breakdown of it and how these writers at a certain time were working through all of these things in interpretation form. It gives you a time and understanding of how they viewed the temple. It gives you a time and view how they viewed the past and how God had judged humanity and their sin and how God intends to judge humanity in the future and how God even did it during the time of the Babylonian captivity. All of these things will be beneficial for anybody who's willing to read them. So I hope that you will take these into consideration, take these writings into context and say, hey, there's something here that should be examined, explored, and studied, but it should be left at that. So I would encourage it. I would also encourage you don't take it too far, that you would go to the place of saying, well, maybe these are canonical. I don't think that's the manner in which we should handle this at all. Now, folks, if this is your first time visiting Facts, I'm so glad you're here. We like to do episodes like this. We do one weekly that is built around YouTube and the podcast. If you're listening to this on the podcast, thank you for joining. If this is your first time, make sure you hit the subscription, you hit the notification so that when new episodes like this come out, you're able to get these things as soon as they are released on your favorite platform. We are on 7. If you're watching this on YouTube, thanks also for joining here. We have been building YouTube up for about 1 year and 3 months now. Thank you for being a follower of that. If you've been following, but you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button, hit that link there for us so that you can follow it and get notifications. So make sure you hit the bell there. Also make sure you're hitting the like button because see, this really helps us if you do that. If you hit the like and subscribe button, it helps advance the video through algorithm. It helps more people get notification of it. There'll also be shorts and other things from this very thing released later where people are going to find this video through other means. But you can be a big help of that by hitting the like and subscribe button, commenting after the video and in the live stream. And then you can also come behind it and share it on your favorite platforms of social media. That'll really, really help us get these kinds of really messages and content out. Also, if you've been following for a while and you have benefited from this, and I cannot tell you the countless emails and messages I've received on social media platforms and in my own personal email, I have received from many of you. I cannot thank you enough for all of the things that you've said and how we've helped you, how we've given you some sort of insight to your understanding of church history or the reliability of the Old Testament, New Testament, as well as your journey of faith. We appreciate you and we appreciate all that you have said. If you want to continue to support us, one of the things you can do is hit the link in the description. There's a place where you can give toward Facts. We are a 501c3. We are ran by a board of trustees. Anything you donate to us, you're able to write that off and claim at the end of the year, and that'll be a help to you and to us at the same time. We are planning on releasing a website very soon. There's a couple meetings coming up with the board of directors and working on merchandise and things like that so that you can stay connected to Facts and represent what we're doing here. And as we continue to bring special guests on, make sure you tune in Tuesday night this month, this week, here in August. Make sure you tune in on Tuesday night. I will be having a live stream discussion with Father Calvin Robinson to discuss whether Anglicanism in the past is patrimony or Protestantism. Are we a part of something bigger than ourselves? Are we looking at something as Anglicans? Those that are a part of the Anglican communion, are they starting too soon, too late? Where do they belong? How should they view Rome? What is a true Anglican? We'll be defining that. Please make sure you tune into that episode. You'll find great benefit from it as well. Well, folks, thanks again for tuning to this episode of Facts. Hope you learned something. And as always, grace and peace to you. God bless.